Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you're having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. I am fortunate to own a vast expanse of land, consisting of lush green grass and dense woodlands. This land has been in my family for generations, passed down from my grandfather. I've always had a deep connection to the property and could distinguish its boundaries even without physical fences. Unfortunately, my neighbor had little regard for boundaries and frequently encroached on my land, claiming it to be accidental. I knew better. He was intentionally trespassing. I had chosen to ignore his antics until he attempted to dig a path through my land. That's when I realized it was time to take action. I scraped together the funds and had a sturdy fence erected, hoping it would put an end to his audacious behavior. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a more aggressive and determined approach from my neighbor. After a month of peaceful existence behind my new fence, I returned home one day to a disconcerting sight. My fence lay shattered on the ground, a victim of intentional destruction. To make matters worse, property markers were placed on my land, falsely claiming ownership by my neighbor. Confusion and anger flooded my mind. I rushed to review my security camera footage, discovering the horrifying truth. My neighbor had callously driven his car over my fence, then proceeded to plant those fake markers, in a feeble attempt to assert his false ownership. Naturally, I contacted the police, explaining the situation and providing them with the incriminating evidence from my cameras. They approached my neighbor, but to my disbelief, they returned with an unexpected response. "Cop, I spoke with your neighbor, and he presented paperwork indicating that part of the land belongs to him. Unfortunately, based on the documents we've seen, we cannot take action regarding the fence since it was erected on his property. Although he won't press charges, I advise you to steer clear of that area." I lacked official paperwork to support my claim, but I knew his documents were fake. The cop suggested hiring a professional land surveyor to settle the matter definitively. Following his advice, I engaged a land surveyor, who confirmed what I had known all along: the land was undeniably mine. Armed with this evidence, I regained the confidence to use my own land freely, disregarding my neighbor's deceitful markers. Unexpectedly, my neighbor, perhaps fueled by his earlier encounter with the police, called them again. This time, they arrived with palpable displeasure. "Cop, sir, I responded to a similar complaint last week. Now your neighbor wishes to press charges for trespassing, so I must ask you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." Me. I had the land surveyed, just as you suggested, and I possessed the necessary paperwork to prove my innocence. This revelation halted the officer in his tracks, urging me to retrieve the survey documents and present them. Now faced with two conflicting documents, the police were at a loss. They made a call seeking guidance on how to proceed. Fortunately, the town kept records of my request for a surveyor, confirming its legitimacy. Meanwhile, my neighbor's document failed to stand up to any scrutiny. "Cop, it appears that your documentation is valid, and if you still possess the footage, you may press charges for trespassing and property damage if you so desire." Me. "Yes, I would like to press charges against him." The look on my neighbor's face as he was being arrested was priceless. He had been convinced that I would be the one facing the consequences. He pleaded with the police to consider his papers and the property markers, asserting that everything aligned perfectly. However, they paid no heed, as his arrest was imminent. I anticipated a mere warning and compensation for my fence, but the situation took an unexpected turn. My neighbor's possession of counterfeit documents transformed the case from a simple trespassing incident into a fraud investigation. In our jurisdiction, fraud was a serious offense. Foolishly, my neighbor had called the police, inadvertently implicating himself in his own deceit. Meanwhile, the government pursued charges against him independently. Though I remained uninformed about the outcome of the fraud case, one thing was certain: I received reimbursement to rebuild my fence. Months passed, and my neighbor vanished from the neighborhood. A new resident moved into his former property. Speculations arose that he had either been incarcerated or forced to sell his house to cover legal expenses. Regardless of his fate, I felt immense relief knowing he was no longer my neighbor. This incident served as a prime example of karma in action, where the wrongdoer fell victim to their own misdeeds. While I had initially contemplated seeking revenge, the neighbor's downfall surpassed anything I could have planned. I relished in the victory, a triumph achieved with minimal effort on my part, but resulting in astounding consequences. The next one is a pro-revenge story. So this happened around 2008. My buddy Brock had gotten out of the military after 10 years. He had started in the Marines, but transitioned into the Army for the last 4 years before buying a house in Texas. When he got out, he did a variety of jobs before landing a gig with a repo service. He worked there for a year and had a lot of wild stories, but this one sticks out the most as he helped a fellow soldier get revenge on an evil ex. Brock was at the office speaking with his manager, whom I'll refer to as Karen. Now, this particular Karen had a lot of Karen-like qualities, but was a force for good, if you can believe that. While they were talking, they saw a young man enter the office. They immediately noticed he had 2 black eyes and an arm was in a sling. The young man, whose name I unfortunately never learned, but I'll call Ben, asked how hard it would be for them to help repossess his car. Karen called her daughter in, Karen Jr., and had her pour Ben a cup of coffee. Karen then asked Ben to tell her a story. Ben began by telling her that he had just returned from a deployment. He had been dating a local girl that lived outside of the famous Fort Hood. Not a good idea, by the way, before the deployment. Thanks to a previous deployment, he had managed to get himself a used black Dodge Charger, which was his baby. He further explained that shortly after buying the car, he had met the local girl, who for the sake of the story, I'll call Morgan. Morgan was always asking to drive his car, but he would always decline. When he was getting ready for his deployment, Morgan repeatedly asked if she could borrow the car, but he kept saying no. After much needling, he relented, but on the condition that she take care of his apartment until he comes back from rest and relaxation leave. She agreed. Ben left for his deployment while Morgan took care of his place. When Ben came back for leave, he found his apartment immaculate. He pulled his car from storage, drove to Morgan's. He spent a few days with her before handing her the keys and heading to his home state to visit family before returning to his deployment. He returned again from his deployment and found nothing but trouble. When he walked into his apartment, he found a layer of dust on just about every surface. It was almost like no one had been there in months. When he checked his bedroom, he found his room had been torn apart. All of his drawers had been searched and upturned. He tried to call Morgan, but never received an answer. He located his safe, which was hidden, and found it hadn't been touched. He then grabbed his spare key from the safe, called a buddy of his, and they went to Morgan's. As they pulled up to Morgan's, he saw a car there that he initially didn't recognize, but as they got closer, he realized it was his baby. Morgan had the car painted hot pink and put 24-inch spinners on it. He tried the key just to make sure, and the lights flickered as it unlocked. While his buddy laughed, Ben went to the front door and Morgan answered. He asked what happened to his car, and she responded, "It's my car now." Ben walked away and hopped in his hot pink mess. As he started it, 4 large dudes came out of Morgan's house, one with a baseball bat, and yanked Ben out of his car. They proceeded to beat the crap out of him in the driveway before his friend intervened, pulling his concealed carry pistol on the group. He then took Ben to the hospital. I'm honestly not sure if the cops were called on this. I'd assume yes, but even then Ben said his friend drove by Morgan's house a handful of times while he was in the hospital at random times, and the car was never there. Karen stared at Ben for a bit before asking for the paperwork. Ben handed it to her and Karen had a smile form on her face. She then asked Ben for Morgan's phone number. Ben gave it but wasn't aware of what was about to happen. Karen handed the phone to Karen Jr., who then dialed the number. Karen Jr. then began speaking to Morgan, telling her that they'd met at one of the local clubs and wanted to know if she was down to party that night. Apparently Morgan agreed and the plan was set. Brock parked his tow truck at the club and waited. Sure enough, Morgan showed up with the pink monster, parked it, and went inside with some girlfriends. Brock gave them 5 minutes before he stealthily drove up to the car and hooked it up. As he was pulling out with the pink monster, Morgan walked out of the club. She saw her car in the tow truck and began trying to flag Brock down, but he was already out of there. The next day, it was business as usual at the office when Morgan called. She was furious that her car was stolen by them and wanted it back. Karen, using her best customer service voice, told her if she had the registration, she could come pick it up. Morgan began screaming louder that she was going to call the cops, at which point Karen sarcastically told her, "Please do," and then hung up on her. As this phone call was going on, Brock happened to look out the window and saw Morgan standing next to a car in a vacant lot, throwing what appeared to be a temper tantrum. After Karen hung up, Brock watched her get in the car on the passenger side. Karen then looked out the window and had Brock verify it was her. She then began to smirk. Karen then proceeded to call the owner of the property Morgan and her friend were occupying. She told the owner about the car and asked if he wanted it towed. The owner okayed it. Brock then drove his truck over to the ladies in the car and introduced himself. They tried to explain that they were waiting for Morgan's boyfriend, but Brock insisted they weren't allowed to park there. They argued and called him every name in the book. Brock then hooked up their car and lifted it partially off the ground, forcing the two to exit the vehicle. They tore into him until he showed them the tow order. While this back and forth was going on, Ben arrived at the office, and Morgan saw him walk in. She ran to the office door, and Brock proceeded to lower the car. When Brock went back to the office, all hell had broken loose. Morgan apparently tried to snag the keys back from Ben, but he pocketed them. She began to hit him in his hurt arm and warned Ben that she'd call her friends to finish the job if she didn't get her keys back. Karen Jr. had already called the cops at this point, and Brock got in between Ben and Morgan, even telling Morgan to try hitting him to find out what would happen. Morgan then tried to play the pity card and said she only wanted the keys to get her laptop out for school. Karen asked Ben to hand the keys over to Brock so he could grab the laptop. Brock retrieved the laptop from the car, and as he was handing it over, she rushed to aggressively grab it but knocked it from Brock's hands. Completely furious at this point, Morgan accused Brock of dropping the computer on purpose and threatened to sue. The cops then arrived, and Morgan began her sob story again, telling the police that they stole her car. The police questioned Karen, and Karen gave her casual smirk while asking if they wanted to see the security videos. The police watched and listened as Morgan punched Ben several times and heard the threats she made about sending her friends after him. The police then turned to Morgan, who had turned ghost white at this point. She tried to back her way to the door, but the police stopped her. They proceeded to ask about the car, Ben's injuries, and who she planned on sending after him. She initially denied everything, but they already had evidence of her beating him up. She was arrested, and Ben got his car back. After the cops left, Ben admitted he didn't want to be seen in a car that looked like it was advertising Pepto-Bismol and planned on trading it in for a GTO. We later heard through the grapevine that the 4 guys who beat up Ben were arrested. Morgan had ratted them out. Brock had a few more stories, but none of them were nearly as good as this one. The next one is a petty revenge story. A few years ago, my college sports team was flying out for a competition. We were flying out of our own town, which has a notoriously quick and easy airport experience for those of us who know it well. When flying alone, it's generally no sweat to show up only an hour before or even less, but this is always a risk in all airports, even the small ones. Our team of 20 people showed up for our early flight 2 hours beforehand, which, in my opinion, is still cutting it close in a lot of cases. When we got there, we immediately noticed a long line at security, which is not normal at all for this airport. We all had to check our bags and get into line where every once in a while an employee would walk through the line asking people to look at their tickets for TSA pre-check, which means you basically get to go straight through the security line. While we were waiting an unusually long time, we started to pick up on a lot of different people in front of and behind us who were all about to miss the same flight. Some people were clearly anxious and asking the employees what was going on. Unfortunately, about 20 people behind my team and me was a Karen. Karen's flight was leaving in 30 minutes, and I noted the fact that she was behind us in line, which meant she probably just showed up only half an hour before her flight left. Insanity. For the next 30 minutes, Karen pushed past people, some of them were on the same flight as her, without asking for any sort of permission. Karen also yelled loudly the whole time at any employee she saw, complaining about how they were incompetent and needed to let her through. She also demanded that they open up other security lanes so that more people could go through faster. Obviously, TSA guidelines weren't a thing for this Karen. So finally, Karen literally pushed her way through the line and got to about 5 people away from where my team was waiting, and there was no way we were letting her through. This was when I decided to get a little revenge for all those poor employees and all the other nice and respectful people waiting there. Being at the back of the line, my friend and I told the few people between Karen and us that they could skip ahead of our whole team because they were also on the flight that Karen was about to miss. They went through, and finally, Karen got there expecting us to let her through too. Ha! We told her that she was very rude to the employees, and we weren't going to let her pass. She tried to shove past us, which was hilarious. She huffed and puffed behind us and mumbled a bunch of stuff about us the whole rest of the way through the line. Finally, we were about 3 people away from where our IDs were checked. Karen had finally stopped yelling at every single possible employee that came by because we were so close to the front. Remember when I mentioned earlier the employee who came by to remind us to look for TSA pre-check on our boarding passes? Well, turns out Karen was yelling over or at this guy the whole time and never got the info. And when she finally started actually listening to the people who work there, she found out she could have skipped the entire line from the very beginning of this story. Amazing! I swear some people laughed out loud when she went, "Oh, I have that." The next one is a malicious compliance story. I work on a case with people from many different areas. Most of the people on the case work in a time zone that's 3 hours ahead of mine. This means that I am often in meetings or depositions that start at around 7 a.m. or earlier. A couple of weeks ago, I attended several days of a deposition, starting at 5:30, for me, each day. Those days, I left the office at around 3 o'clock. My manager then called me into her office and demanded to know why I was leaving early every day. I told her about the situation, but she did not care. She said, "This is a 9 to 5 job. It doesn't matter if you're in earlier. You leave at 5 o'clock. Otherwise, people will think it's okay to come in and leave whenever they want." Well, 9:05 it is. I started arriving at the office promptly at 9. Unfortunately, this led to me skipping several meetings, but alas, it cannot be helped. One meeting I skipped, scheduled for 6 a.m., is an important bi-weekly one that my manager is also supposed to attend. She has never attended and always relies on me to prepare her a report on the meeting so she can present it to her boss. When she asked for the report, I informed her that I was unable to attend the meeting since I work a 9-5 job and I don't want to give anyone the wrong impression. "No report. Sorry." As I left promptly at 5, I peeked through the window to her office and got a great view of her trying to explain herself to her boss. Today she called me and dejectedly informed me that I can leave the office whenever I want from now on. The next one is an entitled people story. I've been trying to sell this miniature portable washing machine on Facebook Marketplace for a few weeks. A woman we did not know at all inquired about it, and after we agreed on a price, she said the only day she could come pick it up was Monday. I told her that I am 39 weeks pregnant and that I would be induced for labor on Monday morning, but that she was welcome to come pretty much any other time. She insisted she could only do Monday as she had another appointment in town that day. I apologized and told her I had to be at the hospital to have my baby. She then proceeded to send me multiple messages back to back asking if my fiancé could leave me alone at the hospital while I am in labor with our child to meet her at my house so she could pick up the washer. I finally asked her if she was really suggesting he leave me alone during the birth of our first child just so that she could pick up this item, and she got very huffy and said she didn't want the washer anyway. The next one is an entitled parent story. I was working at a large church, 2,000 plus members, and on Sundays I ran the audio and video booth. We had 3 services: a 7 a.m. early service, the main service at 10 a.m., and a late service at 11:30 a.m. Each service ran for about an hour and 15 minutes. One Sunday during the 10 a.m. service, the pastor's wife went into labor 3 weeks early. The pastor left in the middle of his sermon, and the youth pastor took over. The youth pastor did a great job of taking over and wishing the mother and baby well, and that service wrapped up early. We had a quick meeting to decide what to do about the 11:30 service, and the youth pastor volunteered to give a sermon he had prepared for the youth group later in the week. It was his first time giving a sermon in front of that many people on the big stage. He was nervous and rushed through it quickly, then forgot about the closing songs. So church ended at 12:15 instead of the normal 12:45. Everyone had cleared out of the church by around 12:30. I shut down all the equipment, turned out the lights, and went down the hall to make sure the lights were out in the classrooms, as I normally did. One light was on, and I found Kay, another church employee who worked in the nursery on Sundays. She was sitting in a rocking chair, rocking a toddler, and I saw tears rolling down her face. I asked her what was wrong, and she could hardly speak because she was so upset. She said the toddler's parents had dropped him off before the early service and never came back. The poor baby had been there for almost 5 hours. The parents had not given a contact number. All Kay knew was the child's first name. I immediately called the youth pastor, who quickly turned around and came back to the church. The child was very unsettled, either hungry or tired. We had snacks, but no proper food, and there wasn't really a place to put a kid down for a nap. I ran to get some chicken nuggets while they figured out what to do. When I got back, a couple had pulled in right in front of me. They asked where everyone was, and I said the church ended early. They said, "Okay, we are just here to pick up our son." I wasn't about to get involved in the drama, so I just unlocked the door and let them in. The youth pastor was livid and lashed out at them. It turns out the parents wanted some time alone and had been dropping their kid off at church and then leaving to go do stuff. They had been doing this for weeks, just dropping him around 7:45 a.m. and coming to pick him up around 12:45 p.m. Here is the part where the parents are really entitled. They got mad at the youth pastor for ending church early. They yelled at him for endangering their child and threatened to sue. The dad was up in the youth pastor's face and I thought they might fight. But the youth pastor was a big dude and I think that kept the dad from doing anything else. I didn't stay in there. I went into the next room with Kay and the child and gave him the nuggets, which he gulped down. The parents finally took the kid and left. The youth pastor and his wife took us to lunch because we, mostly Kay, were still upset by the whole thing. I think about that kid a lot. I hope his parents didn't abandon him. I wish I had a follow-up, but as far as I know, they never came back. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.